So Dan is going to talk to us about his methodological research, which mostly focuses on causal inference, and in particular, developing statistical methods and machine learning tools to support inference about the consequences of, for example, medical decisions, environmental and social exposures, and policies. Applications areas of particular interest include environmental determinants of health, especially air pollution and health disparities. So yeah, look forward to the talk. If you have questions during the talk, Dan is happy to take some of them. Please raise your hand and he will call on you. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Please sign the sheet.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, yes. Please sign the sheet and make her name legible. Pass it around, so whoever getting this.
Cool. Thank you, Emma. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming. Very happy to be here at UW. I really like UW. I have a lot of friends and collaborators across stats and biostats and public health and other departments. So it's always nice to visit here. Yeah, so what I want to talk about today is kind of a few recent ongoing projects related to causal inference. Specifically related to the combination of causal model selection or structure learning with the estimation of causal effects. I'm interested in combining algorithms that learn graphical causal models from data called causal discovery or structure learning model algorithms, and then using the outputs of those algorithms to estimate causal effects in a way that produces a valid quantification of uncertainty in the ultimate product. So what I'll discuss here are kind of elements of three papers. One is an archive draft from last year. The second, and this is the one I'll probably spend the most time on, is a paper that's forthcoming in Biometrica on post-selection inference. And then the third is a work in progress that's not online yet, but also led by the same student who led the second project, Ting-Xuan Cheng at Columbia. So to begin, I kind of want to frame the setting as being, I'm interested in making causal inference more reliable and robust in observational studies, especially epidemiology and population health. And so it's worth thinking a little bit about how causal models are used typically in these settings. So I'm going to show a few graphical models, a few DAGs, that come from recent papers and published in epi journals. The first one here, the first one here is from a paper that was interested in quantifying the effect of PFAS exposure. PFAS is, I can't say the words, but it's the perfluoroalkyl substances. It's a chemical that is bad for you. It's the forever chemicals that are present in a lot of materials in our world. So quantifying the effects of PFAS exposure on glycemic control so diabetic related outcome in US adults. And they're interested in quantifying that effect, and they draw this graph to inform how they're going to estimate that effect, in particular to inform what variables they're going to adjust for when they estimate that effect. So they say that we think that PFAS might cause or affect glycemic control, but also that these other variables are relevant, including chronic kidney disease, age, hypertension, BMI, all these other things. And this is how we think, or they think, these variables are all related to each other. And the ultimate way in which this DAG gets used in their analysis is that on the basis of this DAG, they select a set of covariates to adjust for when they estimate the effect of PFAS on glycemic control. In another paper, kind of similar, they're interested in the effects of phthalate exposure, another harmful chemical, on the development of fat mass in children. And they want to estimate that effect, the effect of phthalate exposure on fat mass in children. And they draw this DAG here. It's a little bit more bigger and more messy. They're interested in quantifying that effect. And they think that they need to adjust for a bunch of relevant things that they think are related to each other and to the exposure and to the outcome in this particular way. So they want to adjust for creatinine levels and maternal age, maternal BMI. The outcome is in the child. So there's like some variables that are related to the mother, some variables that are related to the child. They specify this graph in order to select a set of adjustment variables. And here's another example. This is one that's about quantifying the effect of a certain kind of maternal infection on a mental health outcome in children, bipolar disorder. And so this is, again, like getting more messy. It's a bigger graph. There's more connections. But ultimately, this is how they think, maternal infection is related to like tobacco and income and race and a bunch of other things that they think are relevant. And they're going to use this graph, again, to select a set of adjustment variables in order to quantify their ultimate effect of interest, which is the effect of this exposure to infection on this mental health outcome in this case. So these are just kind of three example DAGs from recent literature in EPI. In all of the cases, they specify a graph on the basis of their background knowledge about the domain that they're studying. And the way they use that graph is to select variables to adjust for in estimating a causal effect. And you can think of that as like a step along this pipeline, this kind of causal analysis pipeline, sometimes described as a roadmap for causal inference, where you have to specify kind of you first have to specify like what is the target that you're interested in. Are you interested in the effects of PFAS, the average treatment effect of low versus high PFAS exposure on glycemic control in this particular population of older adults? You have to specify the kind of causal quantity that you're ultimately interested in estimating, specify a model, and in this case, the model is in the form of a graph, a directed acyclic graph, or perhaps a more complicated graphical model, which is really a way of saying I'm specifying a set of assumptions that I'm going to make about how these variables are related to each other. Then, on the basis of that model, decide whether your quantity of interest is identified and estimable from the observed data that you have available, then come up with an estimator, and that estimator could be something simple or something complicated. In most of these papers, they're just using like regression estimators, but you could use inverse probability weighting or doubly robust semi-parametric estimators or machine learning based estimators to estimate the quantity of interest and then perform inference and estimate some confidence intervals or something like that. So this is kind of the typical pipeline of one of these studies. As an example, if we're interested in the effect of PFAS exposure, which we might binarize into low versus high levels on poor glycemic control in US adults, our quantity of interest is just this ATE, this average treatment effect, where Y1 is the glycemic control under high PFAS exposure, Y0 is glycemic control under low PFAS exposure. That's the ATE. They assume this particular DAG model, which suggests that the relevant confounders that they want to adjust for are these age and hypertension and BMI and so forth. Then they say, well, based on this, we have now a estimable quantity. This is the identification formula for this average treatment effect, all in terms of observational quantities. So I have to estimate some regressions and then take this outer expectation to get back the causal effect. And they're going to then use some estimator like IPW or whatever to estimate that beta and some confidence intervals. And then sometimes they will do some sensitivity analysis to assess how robust is their conclusion to a violation of those assumptions that they've made. So my point, the first point I want to make here is that if you specify the wrong model, like draw the wrong DAG, it's very early in this pipeline. So everything subsequent to that step could be potentially now on flimsy ground. You may be very wrong about whether your effect is identified or how it's identified or what covariates you should adjust for in order to identify that effect. And so then all the other stuff about whatever fancy estimator you choose to estimate that beta will be estimating the wrong quantity, and so it'll be fancy but for the wrong thing. So it's really important to get the model right. And one way, and in most of this literature, the way people choose a model is on the basis of their background domain knowledge or expertise about the specific set of variables under consideration. But what I'm interested in is using the data to select that model. And there's a long tradition, a long history of literature people developing algorithms for learning graphs from data. This is what's sometimes called causal discovery or causal structure learning or causal model selection. And it goes back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. I know some people in the room are very familiar with this literature. For some of you, it might be new. The kind of classic text in this area on causal discovery algorithms is this book by Sperdes, Gleamore, and Shinas from the 90s. And in that literature, there's like now many different kinds of algorithms that people have proposed for estimating graphs from data. The two kind of classical strategies for doing this are what are called constraint-based algorithms or score-based algorithms. I'm going to just talk about constraint-based algorithms here, so algorithms like the PC algorithm or the FCI algorithm. In recent years, people have proposed many new ways of doing this, including things that don't quite fit into constraint-based or score-based. And there are sort of like new algorithms being proposed all the time, but they kind of operate on the same few principles, which I'm going to describe in the next slides. And I will say that this has become, like using these procedures has become relatively normal and common in some application areas. So like people do this in genomics and systems biology, studying gene expression or like protein concentrations, kind of like comp bio settings, or in neuroscience, but they're pretty rarely used in this observational epi space. And that's kind of part of the gap that I want to bridge. So let me describe constraint-based algorithms very briefly. The kind of fundamental idea is that we want to assume that there is some DAG or some graph that generated the data, some graph that is the true causal model that we think is responsible for generating the data we have in front of us, but we don't know what that graph is. But what we do know from the theory of graphical models is that distinct graphs, even graphs with latent variables in them, may imply testable constraints on the observational data, in particular, testable conditional independence constraints. And the kind of the key idea here is that based on the theory of graphical models, we can go between kind of like structural features of the graph, like the presence or absence of certain kind of pathways, so something that's about a graph object, to something that's statistical, which is about a probability distribution over those variables and conditional independencies that probability distribution may or may not satisfy. So the kind of key, the like fundamental strategy behind constraint-based causal discovery algorithms is that they're going to test these constraints. They're going to test a bunch of conditional independencies, and then try and narrow down on the basis of the conditional independencies that they find a set of graphs that is consistent with that set of constraints. So there's kind of a few key steps to any, or a few key ideas behind the sort of bread and butter constraint-based algorithms like PC and FCI. The first idea is that missing edges correspond to conditional independencies. So even if you don't know anything about DAGs or graphs in general, you could sort of see that if you compare the graph on the left with the graph on the right, there's this missing edge on the graph in the left. There's no edge from x1 to x3. So all the influence from x1 kind of like goes through x2 on its way to x3. And that implies a conditional independence that 1 and 3 should be independent when I condition on 2. And that's not implied by the graph on the right. So the first thing to know is that I'm looking for like conditional independencies because they correspond to edges that are not there in the underlying graph. The second thing to know is what's called the collider rule. So a collider is this particular substructure where two variables are affecting a common child. So x1 and x2 are the parents of the child x1 and x3 are the parents of the child x2. And they're kind of both pointing towards x2. That's called a collider. And that implies a particular pattern of conditional independence, namely that 1 and 3, the two outside variables, are marginally independent, but they're not independent conditional on the thing in the middle, x2. So if I find that this pattern holds in my data, if I run some tests and I find that 1 and 3 are independent, but they're not independent conditional on the thing in the middle, that tells me that I have a collider. And that's a source of starting to learn some directionality in the graph, because it's only this collider and not this causal chain that implies that that pattern of conditional independencies. So if I'm designing an algorithm, I want to look for colliders because they're going to start telling me about directions. And then finally, if I assume some class of graphs like DAGs, which are acyclic graphs, so they have no cycles, then that assumption, that like restriction to the class of DAGs may imply some additional orientations once I've learned some missing edges. Once I've learned some missing edges and some colliders, I might infer some additional directions based on the acyclicity constraint or whatever constraint, whatever class of graphs I'm looking at. There are different kinds of orientation constraints that might follow from that. So to give like a very quick sketch of, say, if I have 4 variables, I'm going to describe to you how the PC algorithm works in really broad terms. I have 4 variables. What PC does is it starts with a complete graph where every variable is connected to everything else with undirected edges. And then it's going to start testing conditional independencies. And when it finds a conditional independence, it knows there's a missing edge. So if I find that, for example, x1 is independent of x2, I remove that edge between x1 and x2. If I find that x1 is independent of x4 given x3, I could remove that edge between x1 and x4. I keep going, I do more independence tests. I find that x2 is independent of x4 given x3. I can remove this edge now. So I keep doing independence tests in some sort of clever way, removing edges at every step. And then I start looking for colliders. So I find that 1 and 2, those were marginally independent, but they're not independent when I condition on 3. And so that means I can orient those edges as pointing towards x3. I know I have a collider. And maybe that's all I can. So like there's a stage where I run a bunch of independence tests. I remove edges. Then there's a second stage where I look for colliders and I start orienting things. And I just do that until I cannot orient anything else. And then I might end up with something that has some undirected edges, or maybe in this case, it follows from the fact that x3 is a collider. It's only a collider between 1 and 2, but not a collider between 2 and 4. It allows me to additionally orient the last edge away from x3 because I know it's not a collider, so it has to go the other way because I have a directed acyclic graph. Yes?
I think that's for clarification what we discussed in my area.
Yeah.
So you're thinking here of doing this from cross-sectional data.
Yes.
Right? So because if you have a time series, with very time series, you could get additional orientations from the dynamic nature of the data, correct? So this is all thinking cross-section.
Yeah, so here I'm talking about I have no time information, but if I have time information, I can use that additionally to do this process better, right? And so there's lots of work about how to kind of maximally informatively incorporate time information. And if you know that some variable precedes another in time, you know it can't go in that direction. So that would reduce the number of tests you have to do and constrain the search space a bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is like a very quick sketch of PC. I hope it's if you've never encountered this algorithm before, it might seem a little bit like magic to you, but it's really like statistically only doing a very small number of things. It's like testing a bunch of conditional independencies, which we have statistical tests for, and then it's looking for colliders, and it's using basic graphical theory concepts to orient some maybe remaining edges. So in order to implement this, we need some sort of test of conditional independence, and there's many tests out there. So I have a data set, I have some variables where I want to see if they're conditionally independent. The first thing I might do is like estimate a partial correlation, which works if things are Gaussian. And I could test if the partial correlation is equal to 0, and I need some sort of threshold to decide what counts as 0, because of course nothing will actually be 0 in practice. Partial correlation is often the go-to starting thing, but there's also a lot of work, including work from people in this department, on tests that are semi-parametric or non-parametric. So tests that allow for a broad class of distributions and have some test statistic that measures association, conditional association, and we test whether that conditional association is 0 or not. One challenge to doing this, so you can kind of like plug in whatever conditional independence test you want when you run the PC algorithm. One challenge that people have noticed in this literature is that the kind of traditional way of doing this leads to graphs that are very sparse, because you're only controlling one kind of error. You're controlling like the type 1 error of this test will be controlled at level alpha if you sort of set things up the usual way, but you may not have power against all alternatives, and especially if you're conditioning on lots of variables. So in this one paper, the 2024 archive paper I mentioned, I propose a kind of alternative to the usual testing framework that helps learn dense graphs. Learning sparse graphs, by the way, is fine in a lot of applications. Like if you're doing genetics, usually people want sparse graphs. But the graphs that I showed you at the beginning of the talk were all quite dense, like things were connected to lots of other things. And that for that, PC, the traditional version of PC, does a pretty bad job. But it does a good job if you replace the usual way of testing, whoops, I keep hitting the wrong button. If you replace the usual way of testing conditional independence with an equivalence test. So instead of testing the null hypothesis that the partial correlation or whatever test statistic is equal to 0, if you test the equivalence hypothesis that that test statistic is in absolute value greater than or equal to some delta, some threshold that means, meaningful correlation size or meaningful association size, then now if I set up a test that way, I have error control over falsely rejecting that null hypothesis, which allows me to be kind of more conservative about which edges I remove. And in practice, if you do that, you end up getting graphs that are much more dense. Like you need kind of like more evidence to remove an edge. You err on the side of being conservative in the sense of picking more dense graphs. And so like in this paper, I discuss, the ways of implementing this and also an algorithm for how to choose that threshold size delta. But the upshot is that I can go from, if this is the skeleton or the undirected part of a true graph that I generated. It has 10 variables and you can see it's very dense. If I run the regular PC, I get something that's overly sparse, but if I run this modified version of PC using equivalence test, I get something with a density that is appropriate to the true density of the data generating process. So that's one kind of statistical modification of the traditional PC algorithm. But what I really want to focus on is what I would do with that graph if I got it. Like once I estimate a graph, my goal is ultimately to estimate a causal effect. At least that is the goal of these epi studies that I'm describing. And so if my goal is to estimate an effect, say like an average treatment effect, there's a well-known criterion for how to use the graph in order to inform the estimation of the effect, the backdoor criterion by Pearl. So in the simple DAG case, if I'm interested in the effect of treatment T on outcome Y, and I want to estimate that effect, I have to select a set of adjustment variables that satisfies this backdoor criterion. For example, in this graph, Z would satisfy the backdoor criterion. And so it tells me like Z is something that I would need to adjust for to estimate the effect of interest. And the theory for that, I'm not going to go into it, is well established. More recently, due to Emma and to Andrea and other people here, as well as elsewhere, there's like kind of more optimal ways of choosing adjustment sets that are kind of minimum variance as well. So not just giving you an unbiased and consistent estimate, but like one that is asymptotically efficient. But the basic idea is the same, is that like it's like a graphical set of rules that tells you what variables I need to include in my adjustment set to estimate a causal effect. So once I learn a graph with PC, the first thing you might think to do if I'm interested in estimating an effect is, okay, I'll just like take that graph. I'll say what adjustment set is valid or optimal as according to that graph, and I'm going to estimate my causal effect using that adjustment set. The problem is that I've used the data already to select a graph, and I'm going to use the data again to estimate the effect, whether that's using like a regression estimator or something more fancy. And so then I have this kind of double dipping problem. In particular, the way the problem is that I want to do this procedure in such a way that in the end, I get a confidence interval for that causal effect that I'm interested in. And if I've used the data twice to first select a model and then the same data to estimate a causal effect, I will not get valid, I will not get a valid interval, meaning the interval will not cover the truth with 95% coverage. And you can see that the problem is actually like pretty extreme. Like if I look, I'll come back to this in a little bit, but if I do the naive two-step procedure where I just learn a graph and estimate the effect using the same data, I get a coverage of like 50%. I get like a terrible interval. And what we want is something that's up here. We want something where the procedure leads to an interval that has 95% coverage. So there's, as you're probably familiar with, there's like a lot of literature on like post-selection inference for regression usually. And we kind of wanted to take some insights from that literature and apply it to this two-step causal inference problem. The first thing you might think to do is just split the data, right? You just like use half the data to learn a graph and use the remaining half to estimate the effect, or however you want to split it up. The first problem with that is that, of course, you have less data for each step. And honestly, you need as much data as possible, especially to estimate the graph, because you're doing all these tests. So that's going to be an inefficient and error-prone solution. But more fundamentally, it has this problem that if you just learn the graph once, there's a good chance you will learn the wrong graph, or like something about the graph will be wrong. Maybe not the whole thing, but something about it may be wrong. And so then there's this risk that if you learn the wrong graph, you'll select the wrong adjustment set, and you'll get valid inference for like the wrong quantity. So if you learn the wrong graph in step one, you're dooming yourself to inference for something that was not really the true causal effect that you were interested in the first place. So what we propose is a better way of doing this. So this is a joint work with my student, Tingshuan Cheng, and a collaborator, Zijian Guo, who was until recently at Rutgers and now is at Zhejiang in stats. And we build on some previous work by Zijian that uses a kind of resampling approach to getting valid post-selection inference. So at a big picture level, what we're proposing to do is instead of using the data to learn one graph one time, we're going to do a kind of resampling procedure that you can think of as a kind of bootstrap, but it's not the bootstrap, but one where we learn m different graphs on slightly different data sets. So we're going to estimate g hat is like our estimated graph, and we're going to estimate that m times, capital M times. For each graph, we can now do the backdoor adjustment, like pretending that that is the true graph, and estimate the causal effect or the target parameter of interest. So we're going to get a beta hat for each of those m graphs, and we get a confidence interval for each one of those beta hats, assuming that that is the true graph. Then we're going to aggregate all those confidence intervals that we learned into like a union confidence interval, and we can prove, somewhat surprisingly, that that union confidence interval is guaranteed to have correct coverage for the true parameter, whatever it is. So here, beta 0 is like just the true ATE, whatever the true graph is, not like a model-dependent parameter. And so that's what's kind of neat. So let me describe that procedure a little bit more. The way we're doing this resampling thing is that, as I said, when we run PC or any similar such algorithm to do the test of conditional dependence, we estimate some test statistic, and we check if it's 0. So it turns out that if you estimate the test statistic and you draw so like I'm going to estimate for a particular hypothesis that I'm testing, so I'm testing whether I and j are independent given S, I'll get a rho hat if I'm using Gaussian, if I'm using partial correlation. I could draw a random sample from a Gaussian distribution centered at rho hat. So it's going to be like a noisy version of rho hat, basically, and use that as my test statistic instead. And then whether that falls on one side of 0 or not, or whatever the threshold is, I will remove an edge or not. And I do that for every test that I run. So for every test that I run, instead of just using the estimated test statistic, I get like a noisy version of the test statistic by sampling from that test statistic's asymptotic distribution. Then I compare that test statistic to a modified version of the threshold, which I'll get back to in a second, but I need some threshold for deciding when it is 0. And that will give me my mth graph. Right? So if I do this one time, I'll get a set of test statistics, I'll get a set of zeros, or a set of like removed edges, I'll get a graph. I do this again, and because there's like randomness in the process, I'll get a slightly different set of test statistics and a potentially slightly different graph. So I'm going to do that capital M times, and each time I'll get a potentially different graph. There's an additional step, which is not that key, but I want to ultimately reduce the number of graphs that I have in the end. So I want to keep only graphs that I think of as like good in some sense. So we're going to have what we call a screening step, where we throw out graphs that violate a certain goodness condition In particular, when you run PC or similar algorithms on finite data, you can sometimes end up with a graph that actually is not a valid, it's not really a valid equivalence class of DAGs because there's conflicting independence tests that are actually not consistent with any DAG. So we want to throw out ones that don't meet that criterion. There's other criterion to use here, but basically it's just a way of pruning the number of graphs we keep at the end. Then in each graph that we keep, we use the backdoor adjustment formula to estimate the causal effect, or you could use the efficient adjustment criterion that Emma and company have produced. But basically, you use that on the basis of that graph. So this is the mth graph. I will estimate. So the graph actually is an equivalence class. So I'm going to have multiple graphs for each run of PC. But for each one of those graphs, I basically, beta of G is like the beta that would be implied if G was the true graph. So I pretend that G was the true graph. I get a beta hat, and then I get a confidence interval. I use the asymptotic variance of that estimate. You could use regression or whatever estimator you want. I get a confidence interval for that beta, and that's my mth confidence interval. And then I take the union of all my confidence intervals across that whole procedure, only using the kept graphs, the ones I don't throw away. So script M is my set of kept graphs. And what we can prove is that under assumptions that this resampling-based interval has asymptotic 1 minus gamma coverage for whatever choice of gamma we use. I should say it's asymptotic both in n and m. So technically, you need the number of resamples also to go to infinity. But in practice, we find that finite m works fine. Stepping back a second, there's a question about how you choose this threshold, and we want to choose the threshold in a data adaptive way as well. The threshold, to make this all work, we have to have the threshold depend on sample size, depend on the number of resamples that we run, a bound on the number of tests that we're going to run. So L is going to be a bound on the number of tests that PC is going to run. But then even so, there's a constant. So there's a kind of tuning parameter that we're calling C star, which is ultimately control. Even once you fix n and m and L, there's a tuning parameter that controls basically what counts as a small partial correlation. So we do have this tuning parameter that is going to control the density of the graph we learn at the end. So a small choice of C star will lead to denser graphs, but potentially more graphs and so wider confidence intervals. So there's a kind of important part to this proposal is that like, how do you choose C star? And we have a kind of way for choosing C star in the paper that kind of it's a bit heuristic, but it seems to work, of like choosing C star in a way that minimizes the number of kept graphs. So we want to like choose a value of C star that leads to valid graphs most of the time and produces but not graphs that are overly sparse. So we choose a C star in a way that like starts small and increases in a way that maximizes the number of kept graphs. And we find that works well for providing the kind of correct coverage that we want. As another kind of theoretical point, part of why this works is that resampling procedure that I described, where I resample the test statistic from its asymptotic distribution, which is like kind of like a parametric bootstrap, sort of, but at the level of each test statistic, not a level of the whole data. Part of the reason why that works is that you can show that as m increases, you're guaranteed to include the true graph in your set of resampled graphs. So it's a kind of result that shows that like that if so here psi hat is like whatever my test statistic is. So it could be rho hat if I'm using partial correlation, or it could be some other test of conditional independence. And basically what we show is that with high probability, the resampled test statistic is close to whatever the true test statistic should be. We can control the distance between the resampled test statistic and the true test statistic in a way that we can describe exactly in terms of the parameters of the problem, such that they're close with high probability. So what that means is that we can kind of control the process such that like one of our resamples should be close enough to the true value of the test statistics that it just gives us the true graph at the end. So that means that our overall interval will include a set of graphs that has the truth in it. And now, based on that, we know that the confidence interval we construct should cover the truth as well. So let me show you how it kind of works. And yes. Yeah, so it's true that the estimates of the test statistics will be independent, but like what the value is of each individual, like we just kind of care that each resample test statistic is close to whatever the truth is. And for that, we don't need to take into account the dependence between the test statistics. Which we could, if we knew all the test statistics in advance, we could take into account the correlation among test statistics, and that would improve efficiency a little bit. But in practice, we don't know all the test statistics that we're going to calculate in advance. So kind of fortunately for us, we can do things at the level of each individual test statistics without taking into account their correlation. Yeah, but good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is the number of test graphs, I guess, or the big M?
The big M is the number of resamples. So this statement doesn't depend on how we choose kept graphs. It's just the number. It's big M is the number of resamples. So if I have like in practice, I set M to like 100, but maybe I only keep 90 or something like that. So, but the statement is in big M. Yeah. Okay. So as a quick illustration of this, here's a simulation. We have graphs, DAGs, with 10 nodes and highly dense graphs, so like a density of 7. So most nodes are connected to most other nodes. We're doing things in a Gaussian setting here, so we could use partial correlation. And we impose a kind of partial time information. So we say that like variables 1 and 2 are earlier than variables 3 to 8, which are then earlier than variables 9 and 10. And we're interested in a particular target effect, which is the effect of 6 on 10. The reason we do things this way is so that there's like some uncertainty about which variables might be like mediators versus confounders for the purposes of quantifying the effect of 6 on 10. And what we get then is this plot is showing how it works in terms of this tuning parameter, C star. So we see that we get over coverage as we choose C star to be very small, but we get kind of nominal coverage that we want as we increase C star. But C star also controls the width of the overall confidence interval. So here we're like looking just at coverage. We're comparing it to the naive two-step procedure. And we see that we get nominal coverage, and that the width, like how much wider our interval is going to be as compared to the kind of naive interval, which is going to be maximally narrow but potentially wrong, is like a factor of about 2. So we get it's not like a factor of 10. It's not like we're saying the interval is like, it could be any number. We're saying it could be between this and this, where that's like about a factor of 2 wider than what you would have gotten otherwise. And so that was for M was 100. We also explore how this procedure behaves as you change the number of resamples, or you change the sample size, and how both the coverage and the interval length changes. But it kind of works the way you think. So as you increase M, you'll do better in terms of coverage, but that will take longer. So you want to choose an M that is relatively small. It turns out something between 50 and 100 works pretty well in our simulations, and that this works well even with sample sizes that are like quite small for causal discovery. Like we have sample sizes of like 500 and 1,000, and it works. Okay, so and then we apply this procedure to a problem where we think we know that there's a causal effect that is known. So there's a data set that gets used, honestly overused in the causal discovery literature, this data from Sachs et al. On protein signaling protein concentrations in a single cell situation. They're interested in like how these proteins are causally related to each other. And there's one particular combination of proteins, ERK and AKT, where they've done some experiments and they know there is a causal effect of ERK on AKT. So we applied, but they don't know the graph. I mean, they think they have some biological knowledge about what they think the graph is. And that's why people often use this data set to kind of benchmark causal discovery algorithms. What we did was we learned a graph, and then we did our post-selection inference procedure, and we get an estimate for that effect that is like remarkably informative. Like the estimate is not like -1 million to +1 million. It's 0.84 to 0.94. So it's like something that is, you know, non-trivially informative. Okay. So everything, yes, question. Good question. I don't think I have that in any of this, but the data splitting procedure often ends up being kind of similar to this, because the problem is it's really dominated by the fact that you will get the wrong graph in the first step.
Very easily identifiable. I mean, with not a lot of samples, you could very easily get the correct guy. You still have the information to the inference.
Yes.
Like high confidence interval around the right thing. But that would be like the view.
Yeah. And so we do have a theoretical result that's kind of about that. So we show that if the graph is like easy to learn in the sense that the minimal partial correlations are high, so like the minimal signal strength is large, then the resampling procedure just resamples the correct graph every time, and so then you pay no penalty. It's a strong assumption because I think that is never met in practice, but like there's like a regime in which causal discovery is easy, and you would want that this procedure would just give you the same answer as the naive thing. And so we can show that under some set of assumptions that happens. But we don't really have an empirical analog to that. Yeah.
Would it be okay to think about that as still being kind of centered around the estimate that's produced with this, the DAG learned on the like data before?
It's not actually. So that's a good question. So because we're just talking about returning an interval, like actually the interval can be like a bunch of disjoint intervals that you're taking a union of. So ultimately, if what we return at the end is just a lower bound, upper bound, it's like I have a bunch of potentially disjoint intervals that I've taken.
So maybe thought of it in something centered around the DAG that you just learn without doing the resampling thing.
It's a good question. I don't think it will be. I mean, I think you could take the center of the interval and return that as a point estimate if you want, but I don't think that will correspond to any of the estimates in the interval in general. Yeah.
I have a very quick look, but the data set that you're looking at, the SACs.
Yeah.
So we're talking, so this expression, so these are all continuous variables, including kind of the Y and the X you're interested in, which means that the beta naught is a regression.
Yeah.
Right? So linear regression.
Yeah. At least that's the way we're treating it for this. Yeah.
For what
Yeah. It doesn't have to be like you could, impose some semi-parametric model and make it the ATE or whatever, but yeah. Yeah, but we assume things are kind of linear in that setting. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then as like a quick kind of like the third act or whatever of the talk, everything I've described so far is assuming that you can learn a DAG. You're basically assuming that there's no unmeasured confounding, right? That the set of variables that I have is all the variables that I need to worry about in order to estimate a causal effect. But in practice, there may be unmeasured variables like this U here, which are not in my data, but which will mess up this procedure. There are algorithms for learning graphs in that context that learn, instead of learning a DAG, they learn a more complicated kind of graph, which is a mixed graph. And it has these potentially bidirected edges in order to represent unmeasured confounding. So it's like a bigger class of graphs, but the procedure is roughly the same. Like you're still doing conditional independence tests and you're trying to narrow down the set of graphs that are consistent with the data. So the challenge that comes up is that if you learn a graph in that space, what it might tell you is that your effect of interest is not identified, that there's no adjustment set that I could use to estimate the causal effect because I cannot rule out unmeasured confounding. So what do you do in that situation? So we take the attitude that if you have learned a model that suggests that your effect of interest is not identified, you only have a few options. You could change what you're interested in. You could like not be interested in that effect anymore and try and estimate something else. You could change the model in some way, meaning like make more assumptions about the model, like assume you have an instrumental variable or do some sort of proximal inference thing, or assume some parametric class that will maybe make things identified. Or you could give up on point identification. So instead of estimating a single causal effect, you can try and estimate bounds on the causal effect. Or you could give up. And so we go for that third option. So we give up on point identification and we try and estimate bounds instead of a unique causal effect. The way we do that is by imposing a sensitivity model. So there's different ways of doing bounds and causal inference. The way that we choose to proceed here is we're going to assume that we're going to basically parameterize what is the strength of that unmeasured confounding in some sense. And then as we vary the strength of unmeasured confounding, we get a different estimates of the causal effect, and that gives us a lower bound, upper bound. So it does require some input from the investigator about like, what is a range of possible confounding strengths that I need to worry about. The particular sensitivity model that we use is this one from Robbins, Rotnitsky, and Sharfstein. It's called the exponential tilt sensitivity model, where basically they parameterize like the violation of conditional ignorability with this particular function that depends on gamma. So gamma here is going to be our parameter that controls like how strong is the unmeasured confounding, or in other words, like how violated is conditional ignorability. So for different choices of gamma, we get different estimates of the causal effects, and that's what leads to a lower bound, upper bound. We also, that's one particular sensitivity model. There's other ones out there. There's this other approach by Chernozhukov et al., and Carlos is on that paper as well. And we also apply it to that approach as well. But the basic idea is we know now there's existing literature about how to estimate the bounds under this sensitivity model. There's a semi-parametric literature that tells us what the influence function is for that quantity for every choice of gamma. So that gives us so the influence function for beta sub gamma is described here by phi. So I now have an influence function that I could use to construct like a doubly robust estimator for each choice of gamma. That's what it looks like. That's the influence function. So, but the question is, how are we using the graph at this stage of the analysis? The way we use the graph is we want to impose the conditional independence constraints that the graph tells us exist to gain efficiency in estimating the bounds. So it's not going to change our estimates of the bounds, but it's going to change our confidence intervals for the bounds. So we get narrower confidence intervals for the bounds. So the reason why that works is because there's this result that we can state that if you have an influence function for some parameter of interest, and then you know some conditional independence holds, say I know that I and j are independent given S, then I could project that influence function onto the model that satisfies that conditional independence constraint and get a new influence function out. And the thing about that new influence function is that it will have a smaller asymptotic variance than the original influence function. So what we propose is like, once you know the graph, you will have a bunch of covariates that you're supposed to adjust for when you estimate these bounds. That's these covariates x. And if I know some independencies among the x's, I can do this kind of sequential projection thing, right? I have like a list of conditional independencies. I take my starting influence function, I project onto the first independence, I get a new influence function. I project that onto the second independence, I get a new influence function. And I do that in like a loop until I get a new influence function that takes into account some set of conditional independencies. And I could show that that influence function is going to have a narrower confidence interval associated with it. But now the confidence interval is for the lower bound and the upper bound. So to show that, we use this data set from Zhao and Yao. that's about heart failure. So they're interested in the effects of low ejection fraction on heart failure related mortality from this data set. They have a bunch of baseline covariates that they adjust for, but they're worried about unmeasured confounding. So what we do is like we learn a set of conditional independencies among these baseline covariates, and we use our projection procedure to now estimate the causal effect under a range of gammas. These are the same gammas that they use in their paper, which give us a lower bound estimate here and an upper bound estimate here on what the causal effect could be for different strengths of confounding. And if we use their original procedure, our intervals for each causal effect are these red intervals. And if we use our projection procedure, we get narrow intervals. So now we could say that the true causal effect we think lies between this lower blue line and this upper blue line, as opposed to this lower red line and this upper red line. So the way that we've used the graph is to improve efficiency in our estimation of the bounds. I'm glossing over like a bunch of details, but I'm happy to talk about that offline. So let me conclude. Yeah, we want a robust causal inference pipeline. We want something that does model selection and estimation and quantifies uncertainty in a way that takes that whole process into account. And so for that, we've proposed this kind of valid post-selection procedure that I think is quite nice and modular, can be combined with many different kinds of algorithms that are constraint-based. And if you have unmeasured confounding, we give you a way of doing the inference as efficiently as possible while taking the graph into account. So I'll conclude there, and thanks very much for your attention.
Yeah, so we covered with the time, but I have a question. So my work is Bayesian, so when I see somebody doing sampling, I tend to think about, how would I do this that looks similar. And so it's not real Bayes, it's quasi-Bayes, because it's something that people call feedback cost, but the rough description would be, do a model for the graph of the covariates, and you get a posterior distribution of the graphs.
Mhm.
And then you feed that posterior distribution the regression model. You're not going to learn the posterior story. So that's just, you have uncertainty of the graph. So you feed it into the regression model. And so that uncertainty is going to transfer into your posterior estimates for the interval.
Mhm.
And I mean, that's kind of a cheap way to do the full model, where you do things in the same thing. If you were doing the full model, pretty much standard theory tells you that you will have the right coverage asymptotically. So I don't know, have you guys thought about strategy of that type? So instead of doing the resampling, use the uncertainty in the posterior to kind of feed through the next step. And then just.
And that gives you valid coverage in the frequentist sense or in the Bayesian
the
sense?
frequency sense.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it that way. I mean, there is a literature in the causal discovery world of like sampling from the posterior of the distribution of graphs. I've never seen that combined with inference on the target parameter, so I'm not, but I believe you that you could do something like that. I guess like if you're a Bayesian, post-selection inference just doesn't arise, right? Because you
need to do it carefully so that it doesn't arise. But yes, you
Okay.
can avoid it. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Basically, there's actually two algorithms in the paper which you cannot read because it doesn't exist. But the first algorithm just says, I have a list of conditional independence constraints that my graph implies. And I want to take those independence constraints into account. So what I do is I say, okay, I start off with an influence function that assumes no independence. I project that influence function onto the model that satisfies the first independence, and that gives me a new influence function. And that projection looks like this. And then now I take that new thing and I project it onto the next influence, onto the next conditional independence, and that gives me a new influence function. So ultimately, what it means in practice is like, because each one of these projections is like subtracting off some conditional expectation of the influence function given some stuff, I have to do that iteratively. I have to like compute the expectation of the original influence function given some stuff. That gives me a new influence function. Now I have to take the expectation of that given some stuff. That gives me new. Yeah. There's times where I won't go into this, but there's times where that algorithm actually won't work, and you need something a little bit more complicated. You need you might need to do the projection multiple times, and so that's what we're working on now. Yeah. Yeah.
That's if you already have the conditional independences.
Yeah.
Okay, it's like, you know, this is about so you learn them, but then you're expecting them to learn.
Yes. Right. So the next step would be to combine part 3 with part 2, right? So like here we're kind of assuming you just kind of know the independencies, or that you've learned them and you don't care that you might have learned them wrong. What you really want to do is do the first thing where you do a resampling, and for each graph you have its conditional independencies, and you do this procedure, and so you might get you might get different bounds for different graphs, and then you take the union of those bounds.